Okay, so the archetypes of manhood. To begin with, what is an archetype? Well, an archetype is an image or a story pattern or a character that keeps on occurring throughout human stories, not just in one time in history and not just in one culture, but across all of history and across all cultures. For our purposes today, these are going to be manly characters that keep on emerging in stories over and over again. Okay, so why is it useful to think about manhood in terms of archetypes? You could answer that question a lot of ways, but the way that I like to answer it is that I look at archetypes like a technology, like a tool that very efficiently transmits a lot of information in a very understandable way that helps you to know how to better live life. Sometimes people get into archetypes and they use them in a kind of new agey or mystical way, and that's not really the way I want to get into archetypes. I really want to use them as just a great tool, a great way to learn about manhood and how to live as better men. To give you an example of why archetypes are so efficient in showing us how to live, just imagine if you were trying to learn about manhood and you got a scholarly book on manhood. It would probably take you a couple days to process through the book and to learn the things that the book had for you to learn about manhood. But now imagine you watch a movie with an archetypal character, a very manly archetypal character, such as the movie Gladiator. What I'm saying is that archetypes in those hour and a half or 2 hour movies, if you have a very good archetypal character, can tell you more about how to be a man, how to live as a man, even inspire you to be a better man than those days spent reading that scholarly book on manhood. It's kind of mind-blowing to think, why is it that archetypes keep emerging in human cultures, even ones that have very little or no connections with each other across wide swaths of time? And that's an interesting question, but it's not one I want to delve into today. Thinkers like Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung have spent a long time exploring that and doing so through different theories, evolutionary theory and other theory. But today, I just want to focus on finding out what are the manly archetypes that keep on occurring and using those in a more practical way. How do we take them to help us to live better? So I want to start with 3 archetypal characters that we're all familiar with. And I'm going to be using movies throughout this whole video because I just think that most of us are going to be familiar with those. So the 3 characters I want to start with are Maximus from Gladiator, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, and Braveheart from the movie Braveheart. And I would be willing to say that the great majority of humanity sees these characters as admirable. And so I'm going to start with the question, why is it that we see them as so admirable? And I think it's because they embody a very complete vision of manhood, the central manly archetype, and that is the archetype of the king. There's this book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which is very often the starting point when anybody learns about manly archetypes and wants to learn more. And that's definitely where I started, and that's kind of going to be our jumping off point. I'm going to start where they start, which is with the archetype of the king. But I'm going to modify a little bit their structure and give you some of the things that I found helpful in thinking about an archetypal structure of manhood. So that's all to say that thinking about manhood archetypally is not an exact science. It's something that is It's more like an art. It's something that can be debated around what exactly are the archetypes. And I think the most useful thing is to start where other people have started and then to formulate them as you find most useful to help you to understand manhood and, more importantly, to help you live better as a man. So back to this archetype of the king. On the surface, when you think about these 3 supremely manly characters, Maximus and Aragorn and Braveheart, it can be tempting to think that the essence of who they are is that they are each warriors. And that is obvious why that's the case. It's the manly trait of the warrior is very flashy and makes for very good stories. But one argument I want to make today is that being a warrior is only one part of being a man. And it's because these men are much more holistic men, much more balanced men in other kinds of archetypes that we admire them so much. Think about how each of these movies takes a lot of time to show you each of these men acting outside of the context of just being a warrior. In Gladiator, we see Maximus portrayed as a good husband, as a good father. We see him in religious devotion. We see him talk about himself as a farmer, as a good steward of his land. and we see him acting in very fatherly ways with his troops. And then even when he is in battle, acting as a warrior, we see him using cunning and skill and intelligence that would have broad application outside of just being a warrior. With regards to Aragorn, we see much of his romantic relationship with Arwen. We see him acting in a very fatherly role towards the hobbits. We see that he is a man of introspection, a man of emotion. We see that he has a lot of depth of intelligence to him. He's learned ways of Elvish culture, and there's just so much more to him, again, than just being a warrior. And it's the same thing with Braveheart. We've got the romance once again. We see that he's studied abroad. He spent all that time in Europe before coming back and leading his men. He's got, once again, this fatherly relationship with the men, and we could go on and on. And so I think that's why each of these characters is set up as the kingly archetype. So you're starting to see kind of the essence of the kingly archetype is actually a combination of many other manly virtues and archetypes. And so notice that each of these balanced, supremely manly characters is set on a path to become a king. You've got Maximus, who is set up to be the next emperor, which is essentially the same thing as a king. You've got Aragorn, who obviously even becomes the king. And you've got Braveheart, who acts very kingly and influences the person that does become the King of Scotland. So one point I want to stress with all this is that it is not because these men were warriors that we admire them so much, and it's not because of that that they were set up to be kings. It's because they were such a great balance of many other different manly archetypes that we're going to get into, that they were then destined to be kings, or at least come off as very kingly characters. And so what does that mean to us today? I think that should tell us that it is not enough to be a warrior to be a fully developed man. There's much more to it. So consider some historical figures that we've also set up in a very kingly way and we see as very well-developed men. And my favorite example would be Abraham Lincoln, who, if you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, you would know that we there memorialize him very much like a king. And I think that's because over time we've come to see that he had many attributes across many different kind of archetypal areas of manhood that led us to see him very much as a kingly figure. And of course the other one, in American history at least, would be George Washington, who already during his life people saw him in a very kingly way and probably could have been a king if he would have fought and pushed for that point. Some people like to bring up that we have kind of mythologized the lives of people like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, and they weren't really as kingly or as supreme in their lives. And there's definitely some truth to that. But I think the interesting thing about that is that we just have this tendency to do that. Here we are as humans, once again, creating archetypes. And I think the reason we do that is because when we distill down characters and even historical characters into archetypal form, they become more easy to remember. They inspire us. They, again, help us to know what it means to live right. They give us our standards of value as society. Okay, so we've identified the king as the central archetype, the archetype that really is a combination of the other manly archetypes. So what are these other manly archetypes? Well, the standard formulation that we have in the book that I showed you is king, warrior, magician, lover. But over time, I've modified that. I think it makes more sense to have it be king, warrior, wizard. I add one, which is father. And then instead of calling it the lover, I like to call it the romantic for reasons that I'll get into. And the way that I like to see this is that the king is the central archetype, like the pinnacle of a pyramid. And down at the base of that pyramid are these other four archetypes. Again, warrior, wizard, father, romantic. Okay, so let's dive into these other archetypes, starting with the warrior. And examples from movies that I think really get to the essence of the warrior are any movie that has a Navy SEAL kind of character at the heart of it, because the Navy SEALs really embody the warrior archetype. So that would be like American Sniper. That would be like Lone Survivor. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger, maybe if you could imagine him in Terminator 2, really embodies the warrior. But the warrior is also first responder type characters. So in a recent movie, Only the Brave, about the Arizona firefighters that perished, I think you saw a lot of warrior culture in those men as well. So the warrior is all about survival, all about protection, and all about action. And throughout history, the warrior, of course, has been an extremely important archetype or role of men throughout history. And why? Because I think throughout history, humanity has very often had survival and defending themselves and keeping people from danger as the prime concern of life. So it makes sense why the warrior would occupy such a big space in our mind as regards to manhood. So a few thoughts about the warrior archetype. The first one is that, interestingly enough, even though humanity has always been dealing with survival, today we don't have that concern as much throughout much of humanity. And so as a result, the warrior archetype, the warrior ethos, isn't needed as much in society. But that doesn't mean that men shouldn't still see the importance of being able to embody the warrior archetype. So I think how men should approach this today is that they should be ready to be a warrior if they were ever needed to be one. And so that's why it's important for men to keep up the strength and agility of their bodies, to test themselves by playing sports, by being competitive with other men, by testing themselves in the wilderness and other physical ordeals. Basically, I think every man needs to do enough to know that if the next great calamity or great confrontation arose, that they would actually be useful. The second thought on the warrior archetype is that we need to stop thinking of manhood so much in terms of the warrior and start thinking of it as only one important component of being a warrior, kind of as we brought up talking about the king. If you notice, in society we see our manliest men are the warriors. They are our special forces or our firemen, our first responders. And I can see why we do that. It's because we want to honor the role that they do, which is difficult and self-sacrificing. But I don't think we should tie that to being the most manliest person. And that's because there's so much more to being a man. And in a society today where we just don't need as many warriors, it's important to disassociate manhood as being completely embodied within the warrior. So the third thought on the warrior that I've had comes from the wisdom of Aristotle, and that is that any virtue taken to an extreme becomes a vice. And this is going to be the case with any of these archetypes. So if you have too much of the warrior in you, if you associate this as the end-all be-all of manhood, then that's a bad thing. And I think it's the excess of the warrior, when we see that too much in guys who, again, just go too far down that path, that we see that kind of toxic masculinity label stick when people throw it out there. And so the best thing to do is to see that the warrior energy needs to be balanced, not an excess of it, but of course not a deficiency either, because a deficiency means that in the case of a calamity, you'd be a useless, cowardly little whelp. So you don't want to have too much of it, you don't want to have too little of it. Okay, so on to the next archetype, and that is the archetype of the wizard. Examples of this archetype shouldn't be too hard to think of. These are characters like Yoda. These are characters such as actual wizards like Dumbledore and Gandalf. But these are also characters like Luther in the Mission Impossible series. So the essence of the wizard type characters is people that have a specialized knowledge, a great deal of a specialized knowledge. So much so that they can produce results in something useful that are essentially magical to the rest of us. So again, some thoughts on the wizard archetype. The first one is that it's really developing this wizard archetype within ourselves, a specialized body of knowledge that is so useful, it almost appears magical to people, that is the essence of being able to make a living in this world. It's really the wizard archetype coupled with some of the action of the warrior, that bringing that together is you making a living. Because of course all of us need to be able to offer something of great value, a body of knowledge of value enough that somebody would give us their dollars for the magical results that we can produce through the skills and knowledge that we've developed. A second thought about the wizard archetype is that as we get into these singular archetypes like the warrior and the wizard, I often find that I don't exactly want to be like these characters. And that's normal because these characters are kind of the attribute to the extreme. So I think it's more important that we learn about the attribute through these characters. We don't have to necessarily feel like they are embodying the ideal like the king archetype does. And the third thought about the wizard archetype is that all of us should try to develop some sort of specialized knowledge in life. And if you think about it, the possibilities are endless. I mean, I am not a person that works on cars, and so a good auto mechanic is a wizard to me. They're a whiz at what they do if they do it well. They can produce magical results that, again, are completely magical to me. And so you could be a whiz at being an investment banker. You could be a whiz as a scholar. You could be a whiz sanitation worker. Certainly we need those employing that magical knowledge in society. All right, next on to the father archetype, which is my addition to the classical formulation. This one isn't usually found there. And so characters that I think fall into the fatherly archetype are like Roberto Benigni in the second half of the movie Life is Beautiful, or George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, or Coach Boone in Remember the Titans, or even Deckard in Blade Runner 2049. So the essence of the father is all about teaching the basics of life and the basic necessities of life and providing the basic necessities of life. And it's also about putting the needs of others before your immediate needs. And so again, think of George Bailey and the way he does that. And really for most of the movie, it's not for his children, it's for his community in which he has this kind of fatherly role, which he provides the basics of life for others, and he puts the interests of others before his own interests. I don't have too much thoughts on this archetype because I think a lot of us will already know what the fatherly archetype is. But the one thought I do have is you don't have to fulfill this archetype just as a biological father, just as that example with George Bailey just gave. There's so many settings in life beyond just being a biological father in which you can provide the basics of life for others. You can teach the basics of life to others. And so I think it's becoming of all men to fulfill this archetype in some sense. Before their biological father, when their biological father, certainly I think that's the fullest sense of the father archetype, but then afterwards as well. There's so many ways in our communities that we can do this. And that brings us to the final archetype, which is the archetype of the romantic. And examples of this would be Gene Kelly in pretty much any movie he's in, Roberto Benigni in the first half of Life is Beautiful, Ryan Gosling's character in the recent movie La La Land, and I think even WALL-E is very much a romantic. So I like to use the label romantic for this archetype rather than lover, because I think it is romance that it's at the heart of this archetype. And romance in the fullest sense of the word, not just in romantic love. So within that concept of romance is a development and a love for music, for dance, for art, for food, for romantic love, really anything that's about the senses and the passions. I think to a lot of men, especially to those that have a proclivity toward the more classically manly archetypes like that of the warrior, this one is not as appealing. But I think one thing to point out is just think of Maximus and Aragorn and Braveheart, again, to bring them back into the picture. Those movies go to great lengths to show them all as romantics in very different senses of the word romantic. So if you really think about it, you're missing out on a lot of life if you don't have some sense of romance within you. And if you don't have some sense of romance, yeah, you'll probably struggle at just that basic task of wooing a woman. You know, a woman wants some romance in that process, or at least most women do. So it is an important part of life, and even if we don't have a proclivity toward it, that's what these archetypes are for, to show us different ways that we can develop ourselves in ways that we might be lacking. Okay, so those are the manly archetypes, at least as I like to construe them. And so my main purpose today was that I wanted to lay them out just to get them in your mind so you'd start seeing them and thinking about them and letting them kind of inspire you to know in what ways you have them or you lack them. So a few parting thoughts. First, are there other archetypes other than these? I think you could definitely make the argument that there are. If you start paying attention to stories, there are other male characters that you see over and over again. Detective comes to mind. There's a lot of those kind of characters. Prophetic kind of male characters, so prophet type characters, savior type characters, I think you could see a lot of. Another thought is, as we've talked about this, maybe you've noticed that you might have kind of a dominant archetype in yourself. And that's to be expected. I think most of us do. We might have one archetype kind of in the foreground and other archetypes in the background. And so I think the important thing is to notice is that if some archetype is so far in the background that it's virtually non-existent in you, then you probably would want to develop yourself more in that one. And really taking all the archetypes into account, ask yourself, do you have a combination of those archetypes in some way that leads you to be a kingly figure, which is, I think, what we all should be striving for. Doesn't mean, of course, we're all going to be kings. There's not been many of those in the world, but I think there's many ways in which we could all be kingly, and many roles in our life in which we could live that out, and people would appreciate if we would act kingly, like those characters of Maximus and Aragorn and Braveheart. One other point is that the authors of King, Warrior, Magician, Lover point out that there is an immature and a mature form of every archetype, and I think that's something to keep in mind. For example, for the king archetype, they say that the immature form of that is the hero. And even though we hold out the hero as something very admirable and something we'd want to be, there is kind of something to that it's more immature. Maybe as an adolescent, you'd want to be a hero, but as you grow up, being a hero isn't something that we actually strive for in life. It's more, and that's why a lot of times when people are labeled heroes, they say, I'm not a hero. But it's really more, the king is kind of a more mature sense of that same hero type of role in life. And so each of the other archetypes has an immature and a mature form, just like, as we pointed out, that they have negative forms when you have an excess of them or a deficiency of them. So now that you have these archetypes of manhood out in front of you, I hope you'll find them the useful tools that I have in identifying the aspects of manhood that have been important from time immemorial, and hopefully they inspire you to better develop yourself into a more kingly archetype. In the end, I hope you enjoyed this video, so thanks for watching, and I hope to see you out in the arena.